which was the 112th surah, 112th chapter, and he told them where it was to go and how it was to go. And he received that revelation. Then when he died in 632 AD, or 11 AH after Hijrah, when he died, it was already put into place much of what he had mentioned before he died. And here's what I mean. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had taught a group of people called ulama, or judges, or scholars. And he said that the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets, and that after he dies, the scholars are supposed to be in charge of the safeguarding of the religion, the teaching of it, and the dissemination of it among the people. And he made particular reference consistently to Abu Bakr. Now, when he died, the scholars split into two groups. One that were focused on preparing his body for burial, which was 3 days. They prepared the body. Of the others who prepared to choose his successor, and they ultimately chose Abu Bakr because of what had been mentioned about him before and the instructions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ prior to then. Once that successor Abu Bakr was chosen, then he began to receive letters from some of the other Arab tribes. Some of the other Arab tribes said, we used to pay charity to Muhammad, but he was a prophet and you're no prophet, so we're not going to pay any charity to him. The name of that charity was called Zakatul Fitr. Zakatul Fitr is a charity that Muslims are required to give once a year after the month of Ramadan. It's 2.5% or 1/40th on their gross income that they've had throughout the year. If they have held between one Ramadan and another Ramadan, at least £800 in their account.
So it's a bit like tithing in the Christian
That's
world.
correct. They have to give 1/40th of that as charity. So when they refused to do that, there was a huge segment of the Muslim population that was deprived of meat, grain, clothes, and Abu Bakr said, we're not going to allow that. And they protected themselves with the sword. So Abu Bakr was drawn into fighting with these people. There were also 4 false prophets that rose up: Musaylima, Tulayha, al-Aswad al-Ansi, and a false prophetess named Sajjah. So it was a very tumultuous time for the Muslims because their prophet had died. The scholars had to deal with people who were refusing to pay the charity, and they had false prophets and prophetesses rising up.
Okay, and is that where we see the emergence of the Sunni Shia, the different denominations? Is that where it started? You started to see these denominations?
No, the Sunni Shia divide, as we see it now.
Yes.
The Sunni Shia divide did not start until 400 years. All of what we know theologically and everything of what we're calling Shia'ah today was not until 400 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Now, as for the discussion regarding succession, that was an issue that was later picked up on people who would later be known as Shi'ah, because they had a great devotion to Ali. The beginning of the Shi'ah Sunni split regarding leadership began with Uthman, because when Uthman, who was the third Khalifa, when he was murdered, you had the appearance of a group called the Khawarij. Well, they re-emerged, and then you had the beginnings of another group of people who were beginning to appear, who were called the Rawafid. And the Rawafid are sort of the ancestors of what we're calling the Shi'ah today.
Okay, so I mean, just for clarification, after the Muhammad Prophet, after the Prophet Muhammad died,
Yes.
The leaders of the Muslim community were called caliphates.
They were called Khalifas, that's right.
Caliphates, okay. And this is where the dispute starts in terms of who were the true caliphates.
Yes, because for the first 3, there was no dispute regarding them, because the scholars were in charge of the Muslim world, and they were looking after the Muslim world. Our first rulers were scholars, so they knew how to dispense things, how things should be done. After the death of the 3rd Khalifa, the 3rd scholar of the Muslims, there began to be disputes regarding Ali becoming in charge after that. And here's how it happened. When Uthman was murdered, there were some people who were very angry regarding the death of the third Khalifa, Uthman. And they wanted the people that had killed Uthman brought to justice. But what Ali, who was the fourth Khalifa, what he said is he said that Uthman had been killed by an army of people. It had come from Egypt. There was a group of people called the Khawarij. They had done the killing.
Yes.
So I have to stabilize the Muslim governance first before I can actually go after the people that murdered Uthman. Because Uthman was murdered by an army, we have to raise an army to find who was responsible for it and then bring them to justice.
Yes.
Ali also moved the administrative district of the Muslims, because administratively what happened is Ali moved the capital of the Muslim world from Medina into Iraq, which they had a twin capital at both Kufa and Basra. And this created logistical issues, administrative issues. It created a lot of other problems. Now, a man came to Ali during this time by the name of Abdullah ibn Sabah and told him that, do not worry about what others say to you. You are the greatest out of all of the other leaders, and you are our hero. And he began to make all these strange comments. Ali rejected these flattering comments, but the man Abdullah bin Sabah, he began the process of writing down some of the exaggerated theories and beliefs that they had about Ali. When Ali was murdered, when he was assassinated, what happened is then his son, al-Hassan, was put forward by the scholars as the next leader. When al-Hassan was poisoned, before he was poisoned, he spoke to another one of the Muslim scholars, Muawiyah, and Muawiyah became the Khalifa. But after the poisoning of al-Hassan and then Muawiyah died, what happened is a group of laymen took control over the Khilafah system, and the first layman to rule the Muslim world's name was Yazid. And this is really where a lot of the problems came in from.
Now, but just going back to this Sunni Shiite thing, because
Yeah.
those who believed in the legitimacy of the three rulers
Right.
prior to Ali,
Yeah.
the three rulers after Muhammad died,
Yes.
became known as Sunnis.
Yeah.
And the minority who disagreed and believed that Ali was the only rightful successor
That's correct.
became Shia.
That's correct. Now that belief was not extant during those years. We have the use of the word Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah or Ahlus Sunnah, which is it's the actual full word. It's the people nowadays in English translation say Sunni, but the actual word is Ahlus Sunnah. That was the name that they used for themselves. And this dispute did not exist during that time period in the way that it later developed.
Okay.
After that issue developed, when these groups, the group called the Shi'ah, when they developed, then they developed that theology that Ali was the rightful successor. Because when Ali became the Khalifa, none of the companions disputed his becoming the Khalifa.
Yes.
But they also didn't mention that he was better than the other companions.
Yes.
So this dispute took on a theological coloring later, when the Shi'ah, who at that time were known as Rawafid from Abdullah ibn Sabah, when they finally had written down and codified all their books. And that's where the issue really came, and it came later than Ali's death, much, much later.
But today, it seems to be one of the key factors dividing Iraq at the moment.
Yes.
This so-called sectarian war.
It's a theological issue, because the issue over succession that's probably the easiest issue. The issue between Sunnis and Shia really come down to the following. One, who has authority in Islam? Is it their scholars or the scholars of what we're calling Sunnis? Is the Quran the infallible speech of Allah, or was it created at some point in time? Is salvation by faith alone, through grace alone, or is it by faith and deeds, in which you are helping in the process of salvation? You become purified partly by your own means, and you're justified through your faith and your deeds. Or as the Sunnis say, are you justified by faith alone, through grace alone, which has been granted by Allah alone? Or The other issue that's between us, the other issue that's between us has to do with our legal authorities. Sunnis have 4 legal schools. The Shia'ah among them have 3, or 1 large legal school with subdivisions within it. So we have these disputations. Do we consider our scholars infallible, as they do, or do we consider them upright and righteous and highly noble, but not infallible, as the Sunnis say? These are the main issues, and what's divided Iraq more deeply.
But if you look at Christianity, there are many, many denominations.
Yes.
But you don't see them blowing up each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this sort of violence that we see in Iraq, you don't see that in Christianity, do you? I mean, not anymore. Anyway,
yeah, I think if you looked at Ireland, we're still seeing, with some of the Republican and Protestant groups, we're still seeing that. If we're looking in Bosnia Herzegovina,
okay,
it's there. If you're looking at the war in Indonesia between Christians and Muslims, part of it started at first with some of the Christian factions warring with each other. If you look at the battle between the Russian Orthodox and some of the Greek Orthodox, there have been these battles, and they still rage today. Even the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to this day, it's a Muslim that has to open the gates to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred church, because the fact that the Armenian Orthodox don't think that the Protestants are Christians. And so there had been violence before, and there are occasional flare-ups every now and then. So it is definitely there.
This is why last week's show I was asking, is religion a force for good?
Yeah.
Because there's so much violence. I don't know if maybe the challenge for religion is how to defeat human nature. Because maybe it's human nature that likes war and violence if you disagree. But one would think that, because really, you and I haven't really gone into the principles of Islam, in terms of, peace, etc. We haven't gone into the 5 pillars of Islam.
Right.
But so I don't want to kind of dwell on the Sunni Shiite difference, because that might just be a distraction, because I think all religions have these disagreements.
Sure.
But the question really that bothers me is, can't some compromise be found? This bloodletting, is that the only solution? Why is it that we can't see the emergence of peace by dialogue, especially since these are 2 religious sects of a religion, that should be all about peace, but we're not quite seeing that peace.
I think when you look at these issues, you need to split them into 2 points. Number one, it must be remembered that Sunnis, or what we're calling Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, or Muslim Orthodoxy in English, are 1.5 billion worldwide. The Shia are some 165 million. It would be far easier for them to come into communion and to leave some of the more abhorrent practices that they have and theological beliefs that fuel their understanding than it would to tell 1.5 billion people to do the same. Secondly, or perhaps this can be 1B, is this. If you look at the history of all the different groups among the Muslims today, all of them are originally spin-offs from what we're calling Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. That term we find among the very disciples of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We find this expression being used among them, their successors, and their successors' successors. So we see that the community was unified upon that understanding and that principle. It wasn't until the 4th age, which was, say, the 4th century onwards, that you really start to find the proliferation of these different and new groups. So I don't think it's so much a matter of, say, an issue between Sunnis and other denominations. I think the question that needs to be asked is, why did those other denominations leave what we're calling Ahlus Sunnah? That's where I think the dispute lies.
The lies, okay. And I guess we'll always have this dispute.
As long as they don't come into full communion regarding some of the wider issues. I mean, for example, if someone believes that temporary marriage which is a tenet within